My name is J.R.R. Ortiz. I teach theology in the religion department and am the director of the Saint Benedict Institute. And we're very pleased to be hosting Bradley Birzer here tonight. This talk is supported by a grant from the Lumen Christi Institute with funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And this event is co-sponsored by our friends in Markets and Morality, the English department, and the religion department. And thank you to all of our co-sponsors. The dominance of technology in our lives and the precipitous rise of artificial intelligence in the last few years has raised profound questions. We're being asked to think more deeply about what it means to be human, how we should and whether we can live with our own creations, and what kind of life we can all share together. We need clear thinking and wise voices, and that is why I'm delighted that Dr. Birzer is here tonight to speak to us about the thought of J.R.R. Tolkien. Dr. Birzer is the Russell Amos Kirk Chair of American Studies and Professor of History at Hillsdale College, where he's taught for 27 years. He's the author of several books, including J.R.R. Tolkien's Sanctifying Myth, and coming out in November, Tolkien and the Inklings, Men of the West. Tonight, Dr. Birzer will speak on Tolkien, Technology and Magic, the Battle for the Soul of Civilization. Please help me welcome Dr. Birzer.
Well, good evening, everyone. Very good to see all of you, all of your faces. This is great. It's been a crazy day. I had two normal classes this morning in which I teach American heritage, and those were both on, well, manifest destiny, not a pleasant subject, actually. Kind of a lot of racism and a lot of craziness and imperialism. And then I got to go speak to the Rotary Club right after that on the dignity of the human person in the Declaration of Independence. Then I got in my car, solid rain all the way here until I got to Holland and it turned to snow. And when I woke up this morning, no joke, it was 61 degrees as I walked to my car. Not that now. But anyway, none of that is to suggest I'm not happy to be here. I'm very, very happy to be here. And very happy I'm alive. And that my car's technology, my Honda, did really well with all the rain and everything. So even though I'm going to be knocking technology tonight, technology did bring me here. And I would be a bit of a hypocrite. I mean, right there, I've got my iPhone, and so I've got to be a little careful what I say. I really want to thank Jared. He and I had just a wonderful time at dinner tonight. We went to an Irish pub. We did not drink anything more offensive than iced tea, but we were at a pub, and it was great, and really got just a great chance to hang out. And I want to thank Jack as well, and the Saint Benedict Institute, and just Hope College overall. Okay, I'm going to start with this. I want to do a reading from Tolkien, and there are a couple of things that I want us to think about with Tolkien tonight, and think about the idea of technology. But I'm very interested, especially in something in the Two Towers from The Lord of the Rings, when we have Frodo and Sam and Gollum crossing the dead marshes, and they're in what's called the no man's land. Not accidental. That's the same term that was used in the area between Allied forces and German forces during World War I. And we see here Tolkien, who really never talked about his war experiences at all, really revealing exactly what that war was like. So let me start with this reading. At last, on the 5th morning, since they took the road with Gollum, they halted once more. Before them, dark in the dawn, the great mountains reached up to roofs of smoke and cloud. Out from their feet were flung huge buttresses and broken hills that were now at the nearest scarce a dozen miles away. Frodo looked around in horror, for as dreadful as the dead marshes had been, and the moors of the no man's land, more loathsome far was the country that the crawling day now slowly unveiled to his shrinking eyes. Even to the mirror of dead faces, some haggard phantom of spring would come. But here, neither spring nor summer would ever come again. Here nothing lived, not even the leprous growths that feed on rottenness. The gasping pools were chalked with ash and crawling muds. They were sickly white and gray, as if the mountains had vomited the filth of their entrails upon the lands about. High mounds of crushed and powdered rock, great cones of earth fire-blasted and poison-stained. They stood like an obscene graveyard in endless rows, and only were slowly revealed in a reluctant light. They had come to the desolation that lay before Mordor, the lasting monument to the dark labor of slaves that should endure when all their purposes were made void. A land defiled, diseased beyond all healing, unless the great sea should enter in and wash it with oblivion. "I feel sick," said Sam, but Frodo could not speak. And for a while they stood there, like men on the edge of a sleep when nightmares lurk, holding it off, though they know that they can only come to morning through the shadows. The light broadened and hardened. The gasping pits and poisonous mounds grew hideously clear. The sun was up, walking among clouds and long flags of smoke, but even the sunlight was defiled. The hobbits had no welcome for the light. Unfriendly it seemed, revealing them in their helplessness, little squeaking ghosts that wandered among the ash heaps of the Dark Lord. That's incredible. In every way, that's incredible. And can you not imagine a Jew saying the same thing, being rescued at the end of the Holocaust camps, at the end of World War II? Or maybe Solzhenitsyn being rescued from the Gulag in Russia, or maybe some Cambodian peasant making it out of the killing fields. I think what Tolkien has done in those passages is he has explained all the horrors of the 20th century and everything that went with them. And I don't want to be too utterly depressing here, but I want to be just a little bit depressing as we think about the 20th century. One thing that we often don't take into account is just how many people died in the 20th century by unnatural causes. If we ignore those who died in war, so if we take the numbers roughly from about 1917 up until about 1991, those are the best years we have. And one of the reasons we know so much about those years is because the Soviet Union allowed scholars to come and look through their archives between 1991 and 1994, and then they shut them again, and they have been shut since 1994. So we can't go through Soviet records on this. But what do we know? We know that in that time period, roughly from the beginning of World War I until 1991, governments, communists, fascists, National Socialists, the Nazis, they killed roughly 205 million of their own citizens. It's an unbelievable number. If you think about America right now, we roughly have 340 million people. That would be as though 2 out of every 3 Americans you know just disappeared. These are outrageous numbers. We know that in that same time period, roughly 50 million soldiers died. So we can say with all earnestness that war is hell. If war took the numbers of 50 million in the 20th century, that's huge. But governments killed 4 times the number that war did. It's astounding. And it's beyond our imagination. And this is what I think Tolkien is dealing with. Not that The Lord of the Rings is an allegory. It absolutely is not an allegory. But there's no doubt that when Tolkien gives us Saruman and he gives us Sauron, he is giving us every tyrant who has ever lived. It's not Stalin. It's not the Pol Pot. But yet, they reflect Stalin and the Pol Pot. And I always imagine, here we are in relative safety in America, but let's say that you're an Englishman. You're C.S. Lewis, an Irishman living in England, or you're J.R.R. Tolkien, very distinguished Merton Chair professor of English in, say, 1939. Let's say it's the spring of 1939, and you look out at the world, and what do you see? The Nazis are moving everywhere, taking over everything from parts of the Czech Republic to Austria, annexing everything. Soviet Union doing the same thing, annexing all the Baltic countries, moving restlessly everywhere. And there you are, two good men, Lewis and Tolkien, stuck on an island, wondering what is happening to the world. And then months later, what do the Nazis and the Soviets do? They mutually invade Poland, divide it, and World War II begins. And think about someone like Tolkien and Lewis. These guys have already done their duty. They fought brilliantly during World War I. They had done their time. They had fought for king and country. And now it's their children, Tolkien's children, who have to go fight in this other war. And so let's think about that for a moment. What would that actually do for our mindset? So here's Tolkien. Let me give you just a brief biographical sketch of Tolkien. Tolkien, even though he's English, he's born in South Africa. His father is working for the banks, the English banks in South Africa. It's a moment of incredible corruption because of the diamond industry. Essentially what we would call the mafia is running everything. And so Tolkien's dad is sent down there as one honest guy to watch all of this. And it turns out that Tolkien and his brother, R. Tolkien, and his little brother really can't handle the environment of South Africa. And so the mother, brilliant, absolutely brilliant woman, takes her two sons and they sail back to England and they leave the dad there. And when they arrive on English soil, they have a telegram waiting for them. The father had caught a disease and he had passed away. All right, the Tolkiens have money. They actually have a lot of money. This is not something we would recognize in America, but the Tolkiens in England were famous because they made pianos, upright pianos, and any middle-class family in England owned a Tolkien piano. So they had a lot of money. But here's the problem, and I hope I can say this at a place like Hope College, but this is through the Saint Benedict Institute. So we'll get just a little bit reformational and counter-reformational here for a moment. Tolkien's mom, along with the Tolkiens, was only very nominally Protestant. They really didn't practice their religion at all. But part of their Protestantism was an absolute hatred of Catholicism. And so what happens is the mother, Mrs. Tolkien, starts meeting with Cardinal Newman's students. And lo and behold, they treat her not just as a woman, but as an equal. She's incredibly taken with this, and she converts to Roman Catholicism. And then J.R.R. Tolkien at age 12 does as well, makes a fully conscious decision to become Roman Catholic. Well, this is fine, except it's not fine with the family. And so the family demands that Mrs. Tolkien give up her Catholicism or she can have no more of the family wealth at all. And so she forgoes it. She says, fine, I'll raise the sons on my own. And with local charity, coming from the local Catholic parish in Birmingham, England, she raises her two boys and she homeschools them. She's fluent in Greek and Latin. She teaches them Greek and Latin, everything else that they would need to be homeschooled properly. But then she gets a very rare form of diabetes, easily treatable with medicine. She goes to her relatives and says, is there any way that you can help me out with the medicine? Not unless you renounce your Catholicism. She won't do it. She dies. Unbelievable story. And so there is J.R.R. Tolkien and his brother left without any parents at all. And who raises them? The local Roman Catholic priest adopts them as his sons and raises them Tolkien from age 12 to 21. It's an incredible story. But the reason I bring all of this up, and the reason I think it's so important to note, is that when Tolkien goes off to fight for England, and he signs up, he is not drafted. When he goes off to fight for England, he does believe very much in the English cause. He's not very pro-Protestant, we can understand that, but he definitely believes in the English cause, and he believes in the monarchy. I love what Tolkien says about his own service in World War I. He's a trench runner. He's in charge of communications, and of course, he's a genius with language. And so this is why Tolkien during the war is never quite at one battle, but he's running around everywhere during the war itself because he's delivering communiques. But he is at the Battle of the Somme, and his two closest friends are killed there. And this is a huge, devastating thing for Tolkien. And I always imagine that. Let's say we just imagine him in World War I. He's age 20, he's lost his mom, he's lost his dad, and now two of his three best friends have been killed in the war. This is devastating. And Tolkien never talks about his experiences in the war until the 1960s. And what he always says, and in that point he does say, if you read my book, The Two Towers, you'll see some of my views of the war. So what I read you earlier, we know is his description of the war itself. But what he says about himself is really quite brutal. He says always in his letters, I was a terrible soldier and a terrible officer. And so I had the chance, and it was one of the great moments in my life, to work on Tolkien academically. And I published this in a book. I said Tolkien was a very poor soldier and a very poor officer. I took him literally on this. So here's the story, and I love this. I don't know how many of you are familiar. Brilliant man. He passed away about a decade ago. But a guy by the name of Sir Martin Gilbert. He is the main biographer of Winston Churchill. And he taught for a while at Hillsdale. He would come do one of these special classes where I teach at Hillsdale. He would come and he would teach for 3 weeks, and then he'd go back to England. He had been in Thatcher's government. It's also very important to note, he's also an Israeli citizen. He's Jewish, even though he's also British. That'll be important to the story here in a moment. And I was 35. Yeah, I'm 58 now. I was 35. I had no idea Sir Martin knew who I was. And he came up in the hallway, up with our offices, and he said, Bradley, and I'm not going to do his accent. It was kind of half Israeli, half British. And he said, Bradley. I was like, yes, Sir Martin. I had no idea you know who I was. And he said, we have to talk. It's urgent. We have to talk. I said, all right, that's great. He said, my wife and I will take you to lunch. And so they took me to lunch. It was great. Lady Esther, Sir Martin took me in, and little Brad. They took me to lunch, and we went up just to the next town over. If you guys know Hillsdale, our next town is Jonesville. There was a place there called the Chicago Water Grill. And we sat down, and Sir Martin said, Brad, I read your book. I really liked it, but you got one thing terribly wrong. I said, really? Please tell me. He said, Tolkien was not a poor soldier. You have to understand, every soldier who survived the war thought they were a poor soldier. It's unbelievable. It's amazing. My heart sank at that moment, right? The only good soldier was the soldier who died. Right? Just incredible to think about that. And I'm firmly convinced, and you may well know this, Tolkien suffered from serious depression in his life. He had to be hospitalized a couple of times in his adulthood because he was so depressed. And he would spend a couple of weeks in a sanitarium. Now, once you recognize this is probably post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? What he was dealing with, it makes a lot of sense. But it also, how can you ever read The Lord of the Rings and not recognize that Frodo is going through the exact same thing? Not Sam. Right? Sam keeps his wits about him always, But Frodo, there are times he's on the verge of madness when he's carrying the ring. And I love that, thinking about Tolkien and thinking about how Tolkien brings his own experience into that. So keep that in mind. And again, what a great lunch with Sir Martin that he could explain that to me. Okay, here, this is just a trivial part. And I think this is both hilarious and unbelievable at the same time. Tolkien was retiring from Merton College at Oxford in the late 1950s, right when Sir Martin was starting. So Sir Martin had just gotten out of grad school. They're both in Merton College. They always sat together during all of their functions. Why? They did like each other, but here's the elderly Tolkien with the very young Sir Martin. Because the Catholics and the Jews were not allowed to sit with the Anglicans. 1959, there was still that prejudice. Isn't that amazing? I find that just astounding. So Tolkien and Sir Martin became good friends. But I don't know if you've had a chance, and I just have to bring up C.S. Lewis as Tolkien's best friend. C.S. Lewis, as an Irishman, had no business fighting in World War I. The Irish were not subject to the draft, and the British were not keen on bringing the Irish in because they didn't trust them. And here's C.S. Lewis, who joins the English army during World War I. Why? Because he really believes it's his duty to save Western civilization. And there's this great moment. Lewis talks about this in his autobiography, Surprised by Joy. It's one of my favorite moments in 20th century literature. Lewis is standing on the battlefield. He's in the trenches, and the first German bullets whiz by his head. He has never experienced this before. He's never been in warfare. And Lewis stands up, and he throws his fist out, and he says, "This is war. This is what Homer wrote about." How many of us would react that way? I read the Iliad. Yes, I can fight now. This is great, right? Amazing. But again, I love this, right? Just these different responses to this. Lewis never had a problem talking about the war, talked about it all the time, joked about it. He had actually taken a shrapnel that was still in him. They couldn't remove all the shrapnel because it would have killed him, but he had shrapnel in him until the day he died. But he also lost, and I don't want to get too PG-13 here, but he lost a lot of his bladder. And so that was always, and he thought that was hilarious. And he made jokes about it, even with his female students. So I won't repeat those, but you can just use your own. Lewis was very earthy. I know, especially among Protestants, we've kind of made him this saint, but he really was very, very earthy. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Again, I'll let you use your imagination. Okay, well, here's what I want to say at this point, and then I want to come back to Tolkien again and deal with this question of what's going on with him in modernity. So when we get into the 20th century, I'd already mentioned to you, and I gave you those depressing numbers, we see just huge numbers of people being killed, right? We know that the communist Chinese under Mao, they killed 65 million of their own citizens. We know that under Stalin and the other leaders of the Soviet Union, Stalin was personally responsible for 42 million deaths, and the Soviets overall killed 62 million of their own people. The Nazis, believe it or not, come in third. They killed 21 million of their own citizens. We're all very familiar with the Jewish Holocaust and the 6 million. We rarely take into consideration that the Nazis killed another 15 million, mostly Catholics and Lutherans, in the Holocaust camps, and especially the Poles. They just wiped out an entire generation or two of the Polish people. But here's what's amazing about the Nazis. If you look at the Soviets and you look at the Chinese, they killed over decades. Almost all of the 21 million people who died under the Nazis died in 1943 and 1944. Can you imagine? I mean, the killing of roughly 11 million people a year in the Holocaust. It's just incredible. So again, why? We have to ask this. And I think I can say this without being an exaggerator. We have never, ever in the history of the world seen numbers like that. We've never seen it. If we add up all the people in all of world history. And of course, we don't have great records, but if we go as far back as we can and we look at governments systematically killing their own people, up until about 1917, it's roughly about 120 million total. So why in the 20th century? And I regret this, of course, and those of you who are my age, we grew up in the Cold War, and I think that 500 years from now, when historians look back at the 20th century, they're not going to look at the Civil Rights Act. They might, but what they're going to really look at is the number of dead. And hopefully that will be unusual in 500 years. Hopefully that didn't start a trend. Hopefully that's something that will shock them as well. I pray that it will shock them and not be the normal thing. But we need to ask why. Well, what's going on? And so I think that we can say that there are two things that we've never seen in the world before. One is technology. And of course, technology can be so good. It can be so amazing. Now, none of us wants to go to the dentist even 20 years ago. The dentist is so much better today than even 20 years ago. Think about if you have to have brain surgery. Think about if you have open heart surgery where they can go up through the leg into the heart. This is amazing, these kinds of things that are happening. So please don't get me wrong. I am not a Luddite. But with technology, you can also put 100 people into an oven and throw the switch. This is dangerous. It means that we have atomic weaponry, and that atomic weaponry can deter wars, or we can drop it on civilian cities in Japan. Right? And this is what we do with technology. We have so much technology. So Genghis Khan may very well have liked to have killed 200 million people, but if you're chasing people down with spears, it's hard to do. If you've got an oven, you can do it very, very quickly. If you have atomic weaponry, you can do it very, very quickly. And I have been, and I'm sure you guys are as well, one of the most amazing things, and I'm not making a comment politically, but one of the most amazing things about what we've done with Iran in the last 9 to 10 days is we have really been precise, except for that girls' school, which is a horrible tragedy. But other than that, we have really been precise in our targeting, incredibly precise. And I'm glad, I'm really glad. I'm glad it's not just wanton carpet bombing. But that's where technology can be good and bad, and we see that. And in the 20th century, we saw technology being used in an absolutely brutal fashion. But let me say something else that we'd never seen before. We also have something called ideology that arises in the 19th century. And ideology does not exist in the ancient world. Ideology is something new. It is something that emerges from the French Revolution, and it really is a politicization of religion. It is essentially an ancient heresy that's been given political status. And I love the way C.S. Lewis described this. He said, "What is an ideology? An ideology is a truth exploded to madness." I think that's brilliant. And think about this. Let's just take communism. Communism says we should love our community. That's a truth. We should absolutely love our community. But if the love of our community means we destroy every other community, we've made a grave error, a truly grave error. What does fascism say? We should love our country. It's very true. We should love our country. We should be very patriotic. But if that means that only people with blue eyes get to live in our country, we've made a grave error. And so think about what someone like C.S. Lewis and Tolkien as well, remember they're best friends. When C.S. Lewis tells us this is a truth, think about every one of us in this room. What are we, 80 right now, maybe 90 in this room. We're all different ages. We all come from different parents. We're all born into a religion. We're born into an ethnicity. We're born into a language. And yet here we are, 90 individuals. We see the world differently. And, can Darwin explain me? Am I only biological? No, I am biological. I have 7 kids. I can prove it. I'm very biological. Am I economic? Yeah, I go into Myers And I look at bread prices and I decide this loaf of bread versus that. I'm economic. But I don't do that with my kids. That would be crazy. I don't look at them economically. Or I think about someone like Freud. I'm psychological. Yeah, there's no question about that. But I'm not only psychological. I'm biological. I'm psychological. I'm economic. Sometimes I'm just weird. Like all of us. Right? And this is the problem in the 19th century. You get these brilliant people like Darwin and Marx and Freud, but they were so simplistic. They tried to define the human person by one thing, and they put a hook on that, and then they tried to explain every other thing. Let's contrast that for a moment. Think about one of the greatest documents in world history. We're going to celebrate its 250th birthday coming up on July 4th. Think about the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And what do we hold to be true? That all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and property. Stop. Notice what Jefferson did. He said, this is the minimum of a human being. Now go out and flourish. That's totally, totally different than saying everything we do is economic and everything is based on that idea. And that's where, again, Lewis is genius in saying, what is an ideology? It is a truth exploded to madness. It's something that takes on an aspect of insanity. And I will say, and maybe we could disagree about this, I think communism's insane. It's ridiculous. It doesn't understand humanity at all. I think fascism is equally insane. It does not explain who and what we are. And notice both of those philosophies are purely materialistic. They can't understand the soul. They don't know what makes Brad. They don't know what makes Jared or Jack. They don't get any of that because they're so monocausal in their understanding of what human existence is. So I think we need to be very careful. And again, I take this from Tolkien and Lewis. But I think we need to be very careful about ideology. I know in the modern world, we often mean it as just kind of a set of ideas or a worldview, but that's not what ideologies have been. They have been utterly ruthless. And so again, all we have to do is think about it empirically. We've seen not only what technology does, but what ideology does as well. Okay, well, let's get back to Tolkien. And we'll get a little bit more positive about this. Not quite yet, but in a second. Here's Tolkien in 1969. He is asked in a letter, what does he think about the state of the world? He says, well, let me say, the spirit of wickedness in high places is now so powerful and so many-headed in its incarnations that there seems to be nothing more than personally to refuse to worship any of the Hydra's heads. It's not very optimistic. This is a best-selling author who has just made millions of dollars on his story. He's 4 years away from his death, and he's arguing that the world looks terrible. Well, 1969, I was a year and a half. Yeah, I don't remember it, but I look back on it. It doesn't look that great. Vietnam, what's going to happen in America with inflation, the drug and the sex problem. I'm actually a big fan of rock and roll, but that seems to me about one of the only good things that comes out of the 1960s. I have never been wanton in my sexual profusion or in my drug intake. In fact, I've been pretty good about that. I've been a good Catholic boy. But it was there, everywhere. And so what does Tolkien say? Everything seems to be a Tower of Babel, all noise and confusion. Or we can jump back, and I love this, 1943. Tolkien is asked what he thinks about the world. I heard of that bloodthirsty old murderer, Joseph Stalin, inviting all nations to join a happy family of folks devoted to the abolition of tyranny and intolerance. And of course, one would be utterly blind to miss Tolkien's sarcasm in this. I wonder, and he's writing to his son Christopher, I wonder, even if we survive this war, if there will be any niche, even sufferance left for reactionaries like you and me. The bigger things get, the smaller and duller and flatter our world gets. It's getting to be one blasted provincial little suburb. And I don't just worry about the Soviet Union, I worry about America with its sanitation, its morale pep, its feminism, and its mass production. It will be the ruin of all of us. So Tolkien, and I think we can say this pretty openly about Tolkien, he's skeptical about where the world is and what can happen. And I want to tell you just two hilarious stories, I think hilarious, about Tolkien and technology. Tolkien had the hardest time getting The Lord of the Rings published. And there are reasons for that. He was a bit of a pain as an author in this. And he demanded that you publish not just The Lord of the Rings, but the Silmarillion with The Lord of the Rings. So you can imagine The Lord of the Rings is already a good 1,400 pages long. Add another 400 from the Silmarillion, and you're still under paper shortage because of wartime restrictions. That's the only reason it's a trilogy. Because by law, you could only have a certain number of pages in a book. Otherwise, it was never meant to be a trilogy. But that's why. So Tolkien was a very, very demanding author. And he was pretty depressed that he couldn't get the book published. And so one of his students came over. And remember, Tolkien's a devout Catholic. One of his students, a guy by the name of George Sayer, came and said to him, Professor Tolkien, you're great at reciting poetry. Why don't you read from The Lord of the Rings from me, and I'll record it. And he brought in a reel-to-reel tape recorder. Tolkien was really freaked out by the tape recorder. And he said, that thing can capture my voice? And Sayer said, yeah, we're going to record you. And so what Tolkien did, because he thought that it was a bad machine, he said the Lord's Prayer in Gothic, Old German, in it, to exorcise it of any demons. And George Sayer asked him, he said, well, why did you say it in Gothic? Why not Latin? Well, the devil already knows Latin, but he doesn't know Gothic. Well, it was great. And then, I love this as well, right after the Lord of the Rings did well, the New York Times, a guy named Harvey Bright, who was the main reviewer for the New York Times, calls Tolkien and tries to interview him. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Harvey Bright asked Tolkien, sir, what makes you tick? Tolkien said, I don't tick, I'm not a machine, and he slammed the phone down. So he did not like mechanization at all. When we dropped the atomic bomb, he said, the utter folly of these lunatic physicists to consent to work, especially for war. They're calmly plotting the destruction of the world. And what have the Americans done? They have created their own ring for their own excellent purposes. Again, brutal. All right, so what do we do with this? Let's put a positive spin on it. Tolkien, even as a Roman Catholic, believed very strongly that there was what he called the long defeat. And he talked about this frequently. And he believed that in this world, we were basically heading towards the apocalypse and the devil would rule. But Christ had already conquered in the next world. And so because of that, we need to put everything that we have, not necessarily in this world, but in the next world. And yet we still have this incredible duty to do what's right in this world. And one of Tolkien's most important theories, and this is where he's a brilliant scholar, he's also a brilliant myth maker. He's our greatest myth maker. Let me just throw the gauntlet down here for a moment. I said that 500 years from now, people will look back at our century, and I hope that they will see it, the 20th century. I hope that they will see it as an anomaly. I also firmly believe that 500 years from now, people will read Tolkien in the way that we read Dante, or the way that we read Virgil, or the way that we read Homer. I think that truly Tolkien is the most brilliant myth maker of our day. and of modernity. So in his own genius, Tolkien argued that one of the greatest functions we have is to be a sub-creator. God is the creator. God made all things. And when he made all things, he made them good. With the fall, they've broken, and we are truly broken. But nature itself is not devastated by the fall. It is rendered a little bit incomplete, but nature still reveals God's wonder and God's glory. And so the way Tolkien understood this was one of the highest functions that we as humans can serve is as sub-creators. That is, we create artistically, and it is up to each of us in every day of our lives as moral beings to make choices for the good. They don't get us to heaven, but they make the world a little bit better, and they create the soil in which there are greater conversions. And so Tolkien tells us it's absolutely our duty to bring beauty into the world. It's our duty to beautify that where we find ourselves. If we're artists, we're true. That is, if we're painters, we're true to the form. If we're portrait artists, we find the beauty of each person in our subject. And if we're authors, we imitate creation, not by undoing it, but by making it greater than it even is. And so this is what he tells us, and this was from a lecture that he gave in the spring of 1939 at the University of St. Andrews. His topic was to speak about the meaning of fairy. And we have to be careful about this. Obviously, fairy in 2026 has weird connotations and sexual connotations. That is not at all what it meant in 1939 when Tolkien is writing. Tolkien, when he writes of fairy, and my students always kind of snicker at this, but if you would go into England during World War I, if you went into a working class area and they're recruiting, they would have a huge picture of a guy named General Kitchener, and he would be pointing at you and he would say, "I want you for the British Army. It's where we got the Uncle Sam. I want you for the American Army." But if you went to places like Oxford or St. Andrews, or you went to Cambridge, the poster said, "Defend Fairyland," because fairy meant England. Fairy is England. And so when he talks of fairy, this is a mythological representation of England. And this is what he writes. This is what he says in his speech. "The realm of fairy is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. All manners of beasts and birds are found there, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In that realm, a man may count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. And while he is there, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gate should be shut and the key should be lost." And think about that great scene in The Lord of the Rings where Frodo and Sam walk into the garden of Galadriel. And think about how utterly mysterious it is. And she shows them that mirror. And Sam says to her, "I'd like to see some magic." And her response is so beautiful. She says, "I don't really know what you mean by magic, because you use the same word for the deceits of the enemy." And we have to understand what Tolkien means by magic. Remember, he's a Roman Catholic. Magic means being sacramental. Magic means that the bread and wine are not bread and wine, but the body and the blood. It's not magic, even though he uses that term. It's sacramentality. It is a visible manifestation of grace. And think about what the elves do in The Lord of the Rings. They take a living thing and they make it more beautiful. They make it more beautiful. The elves are essentially angelic beings in the story. Gandalf is without question an angelic being, but so are the elves. And if you remember in the Silmarillion, we get one description of Gandalf. His name is Aloran in the Old World. And Tolkien says that Aloran used to walk among the elves unseen, but he would put imaginations of lightness into their mind so they could put away the imaginations of darkness. That's beautiful. Isn't that what we want to do with our students and our children? For them to have imaginations of light rather than imaginations of dark? Wouldn't we rather have our students read Narnia than Stephen King? I think we would, and I actually like Stephen King, but he's creepy. He's really dark. He has flirted a lot with the darkness. Think about Tolkien. We never get into the mind of Sauron. Never. We see the results of Sauron. But this is the genius of Lewis and Tolkien. They make good interesting. We read about Sam. We don't get bored. We like him more and more. And the better he is, the more we like him. And at the end of the story, is it any wonder that Sam gets to go home to his wife and his kids? Frodo has to leave. He has to depart. Sam gets to go to hearth and home. Isn't this what the whole War of the Ring was about? It was about raising your children in peace and prosperity. And think about what Sam gets to do. His gift from Galadriel is all the bits of soil, the grains of soil that he plants throughout the whole Shire. And what do they say about 1420 in the Shire after Sam has done that? It's the most glorious year ever in the history of the Shire. The hobbits are all a little bit taller. The vegetation is just gorgeous. He has taken something and he has made it better. That's what Tolkien and Lewis call us to do. We can look at the world and we can say, yeah, it's hell. Or we can look at the victim. We can look at the homeless. We can look at the person who survived the Holocaust camp and we can say, that's a miracle. That's a wonder. So do we focus on Hitler or do we focus on the beauty that came out of survival? This is what Lewis and Tolkien ask us to think about. They ask us to imagine what is good and what could be better. Just think about any of us who teach, or all of us as parents. The last thing we would ever want for our students is for them to be made in our image. It's not what I want of my students. Can you imagine if I used whatever abilities I had to make little Brads running around? That's what Satan does. God calls us to be who and what we are meant to be. And that means we are utterly individual. Jared needs to be the most Jared he can ever be. And he needs to make his students to be the most of them that they can be. Right? That's what Tolkien and Lewis are calling us to. So here's what he says, and I want to end with this because I love this. So, I have to put this into context. Tolkien is giving this speech that I've been quoting from at the University of St. Andrews. St. Andrews was basically the third best college. I guess it still would be in the British Isles. So it goes Oxford or Cambridge. I don't know which would be first, and then St. Andrews, but they're all fantastic. St. Andrews had a very long medieval Catholic history, and then it had a very sharp, very long reformational history. Deeply, deeply Christian institution. But by the time Tolkien is asked, almost all of the professors have lost their faith. These are secular men who are now teaching in 1939 at St. Andrews. Tolkien is not a secular man. And I want you to just imagine Tolkien as the devout Christian chastising his audience. It would take a lot of guts. It would take guts in 2026. It would still take a lot of guts and gumption in 1939. But this is Tolkien's conclusion to his lecture. I would venture to say that we should approach the Christian story from the direction of mythology. Why? It has long been my feeling, and it is a joyous feeling, that God redeemed us corrupt creatures, men, in a way fitting to an aspect of our own strange nature. Let's think about the gospel. The gospel is a fairy story. It's a story of a larger kind which embraces all the elements of mythology. It contains marvels, it's artistic, it's beautiful, it's moving, it's mythical in its perfection, it's self-contained significance, and among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe. That's a word that Tolkien coined, eucatastrophe, and it means the opposite of a catastrophe. It's a sudden glimpse of joy that is so beautiful that we don't know how to handle it. It's marriage. It's having your first child. It's seeing your child baptized. It's this moment of absolute joy that will never come again. But there it is. Not a catastrophe, but a eucatastrophe. And I also want us to look at the definition of myth. Myth does not mean a lie. In its ancient understanding, when Plato gives us, and as far as we know, mythos goes back to Plato. When Plato defines myth, all myth is a story that contains the supernatural. That we call it a lie is our fault. It's our stupidity. It's not a lie. It's something supernatural that we can't explain. Not a lie. Those are different things, right? So that's the definition Tolkien is using. But what's different? The story of Christ actually entered real history and the primary world. And therefore, the desire and aspiration of subcreation was actually raised to the fulfillment of creation. The birth of Christ is the eucatastrophe of man's fulfillment. It is the eucatastrophe of man's history. The resurrection is the eucatastrophe of the incarnation. The story begins and ends in complete joy. It has preeminently the inner consistence of reality. There is no tale ever told that men would rather find true, and none which so many skeptical men have accepted as true on its merits. For the art is supremely convincing. It is primary art. It is the substance of creation. And now Tolkien looks at his audience. Remember all of these secular academics. And he says, to reject Christianity either leads to intense sadness or great wrath. That took guts. That's pretty amazing. And so let me finish with this. We can think about the world and we can be depressed. There's a lot of depressing things. I mean, I don't even have to get into details. There's just a lot of depressing things in the world. I think we can say that there are all kinds of peoples in the world who are not being treated with dignity. But shouldn't we strive for that in everything we do? Is this not the lesson of the Lord of the Rings? No matter how small your gifts are, you use them for something greater. You use them to beautify the world. You use them to leaven things. And should we imagine that gets us to heaven? Of course not. But God smiles on us. All right, thank you. It's great. It's a good book.
They've got, did you want to start?
First of all, we'd love to thank you for coming out. We're so glad to have you here, and
Thanks.
thank you for the time and effort that you put in order to create this talk and present it to us. My question would So, looking at the history between Lewis and Tolkien, it's no secret the effect that Tolkien had on Lewis. I would be curious if, in your studies, you found how C.S. Lewis influenced Tolkien's life, whether it be
Yeah.
his view on Protestantism.
It's a great question. Really great. What's your name?
Andrew?
Andrew, thank you. It's a great question, and believe it or not, at this very moment at Hillsdale, Father Michael Ward is giving a lecture, Lewis's influence on Tolkien. He's probably finishing in 5 minutes, and he's a friend of mine, but we just missed each other in this. Yeah, it's a great question. Tolkien, the way people described it, and of course, Tolkien's part of a group called the Inklings. And the Inklings meet from 1931 until 1949. They would meet 3 times a week. And on Thursday nights in particular, they would meet at C.S. Lewis's rooms. And it's a little bit different in Oxford. You were expected to be a bachelor if you were a professor. And you not only have your office, you have a bedroom and a kitchen behind it. So that's where they would meet. And Lewis until he met Joy, he was a bachelor. So that's where they would meet. But what we know is that the way they talk about it, I'm not even sure this is actually a word, I'd have to look this up, but they always joke that Tolkien was completely uninfluenceable. Not even sure I can say that. And Tolkien, whenever he took criticism, he was a very bullheaded man, a gentleman, total gentleman, and he treated everybody with dignity. But he was very bullheaded about his own ideas. And so if he took, Andrew, let's say that you said this chapter was wrong, this, and this way, and he agreed with you, he would just start the whole chapter over. He wouldn't revise it. He would just start it over from scratch. And that's why, we actually have, it's pretty amazing, we have all the first drafts of The Lord of the Rings. And the story's a little bit different. It's not a ton different, but it is a little bit different. But we have all of those. They're at Marquette University in Milwaukee, and that's where Tolkien sold them. And so they're all there, but you can just go through draft after draft of his chapters, and that's what Tolkien would do. He did do some revision as well, and it's really beautiful. He was a great artist. We don't often talk about that. Tolkien was actually an extremely good painter and artist. He couldn't do human figures at all. They're terrible. And I'm not good either, so I'm not criticizing him for that. But he's amazing at landscapes, and his sense of color is incredible. And so in a lot of his manuscripts, especially in the original Lord of the Rings, he actually would draw scenes, and then around he would either type or he would use longhand in the manuscript. It's really neat to see, but that's how he would do it. But again, I have never found anything in particular that Lewis did that Tolkien took. There's a lot that Lewis took from Tolkien, especially the whole idea of Numenor and some of the things that show up in the Space Trilogy. And all for good reason. Tolkien was fine with that. But they had kind of talked about creating a joint mythology. And then Lewis really ran with it, and Tolkien was much slower with it. But yeah. So, Andrew, I hope that helps.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your good words, too.
Hi, thanks so much for.
You're cutting in and out. That's okay. I can hear you.
I'm curious. So after World War I, Tolkien decides to go backwards in time, presenting a more medieval kind of fantasy, very high fantasy, and C.S. Lewis goes forward with the Space Trilogy, and then you have other writers taking their wartime experience
Right.
and making science fiction. Why do you see a juxtaposition between going backwards to a sense of old fantasy versus going forward to
Yeah.
new age science fiction as a responsible war?
Yeah, that's what's your name?
Sawyer.
Sawyer, thank you. It's actually related a little bit to Andrew's question as well. We know that sometime in 1936, Tolkien and Lewis decided that they thought that and we have to be careful about this term, I'm going to call it science fiction. Science fiction was a very niche term. It didn't come into common occurrence currency, I should say. It didn't become a kind of normal term until about 1952, and we've always used it ever since. But up until that point, it had a bunch of different names, and so we don't know what Tolkien and Lewis said to each other, but basically what they said was, we love science fiction, there's not enough of it. And so they challenged each other, and they actually flipped a coin. And the coin was, one of them would do time travel, and the other would do space. And Lewis won the space, and Tolkien won the time travel. And so that's why, that's the impetus for Tolkien going backwards. But also remember, he's a scholar. I mean, he's an absolute genius. You know, he was fluent in 15 languages, and even made up several of his own as well, right? Which is just, it's mind-boggling. Honestly, the only other person I've read like that is John Paul II. John Paul it took about 3 weeks to pick up a language, and Tolkien was the same way. It took him about 3 to 6 weeks to understand the structure of a language, and then he only had to learn the vocabulary after that. I struggled with French and Spanish and Latin and, well, everything. I didn't struggle with English, but I did struggle with everything else. And that's just not one of my gifts at all. But they were just incredible about that. So let me answer this way. So part of it is just that coin toss, why they did what they did. But I'm deeply interested in the history of science fiction, very interested in it. And what's really fascinating to me is that if you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, science fiction is being written everywhere in America, but it's only being published in pulp magazines. And part of this is actually, there's a religious divide here that's really interesting. If you wanted to be a major writer for McCall's or any of the great magazines, you had to be a white Protestant. Catholics, immigrants were not accepted in the publishing industry, and Jews were not accepted. And so Jews and Catholics went off and created pulp, which was very cheap literature on very thin paper. And it's the same way in Hollywood. It's one of the reasons there are so many Jewish directors in Hollywood. Hollywood was a new medium where there was no discrimination. So Jews could go from New York to LA and be fine. They couldn't do it in New York, but they could do it in LA. And so there's a lot of this going on. And the reason I bring all of this up is because generally science fiction was seen as utterly low class until Ray Bradbury and until C.S. Lewis. They make science fiction what it becomes, a legitimate genre. And even then, people like Aldous Huxley say, oh yeah, well, I was writing science fiction. They wouldn't have said that in 1931 when Brave New World came out, but they were fine to adopt that after Lewis and Bradbury. So I would put Vonnegut in there as well, much younger than Lewis and Tolkien, but a soldier of World War II, and of course responding so much to the firebombing of Dresden. So I think there's a lot there that war, whether it's World War I or II, deeply influenced science fiction. And now, where would our culture be without science fiction? Where would Netflix be without? I mean, it's everywhere. Every young adult novel is science fiction in some way, dystopian. So yeah, sorry, that was longer than you probably wanted, Sawyer. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I haven't read The Lord of the Rings in a very long time, but your statements about how the tyranny of people like Saruman and Sauron really resonated with me. Is there a specific scene in The Lord of the Rings, in your opinion, that demonstrates how people can sort of resist this type of tyranny? And why would you think that scene?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, thank you. And what's your name?
Walter.
Walter, thank you. That's a great question, too. And I'm not sure if I could find a specific answer, except that, imagine when, Galadriel is tempted, right, and she resists. But I'm thinking of Faramir in particular. Imagine Faramir when he has control over Frodo and Sam. If you remember the scene, this is in the Two Towers. Later in the Two Towers, Faramir, the brother of Boromir, has captured them. And he figures out, he's very smart, and he figures out what Frodo has. He's not tempted at all. Right? It's like, no, you go get rid of that thing as quickly as possible. That's what you have to do. And I think that's a really beautiful scene. I also remember the one moment, there's that moment, I love this, where Sam has the ring because he thinks Frodo's dead. And he puts the ring on and he imagines, Sam Gamgee, the Lord of the world, what would I do? And he thinks, man, I would just make everything a big garden. Wouldn't that be great? And then he says, nah, that's too much to garden. And he takes off his ring. Right? That's a great thing. And of course, the ring, this goes back to Plato, the ring of Gyges. What happens if you're given the ring of power? And Plato tells us we would probably rape and kill and do all kinds of horrible things. Cicero takes up the same story. And he says, oh, no. If you're a good Stoic man, you would only do good with it. Tolkien gets the story and he says, there's only one Christian answer. You throw the thing away, right? You get rid of it. And I think that's beautiful. And I think that's something, really in Western civilization since Machiavelli, we always talk about power. But if you go back and look at Socrates or Cicero or, of course, Jesus, it's always about love. That's what they talk about. Dante's all about love. It's not about power. Aquinas is all about love. But in the last 500-600 years, we've been obsessed with power everywhere. And I think that's tragic. I think, I'm not trying to be a hippie. I'm a pretty serious conservative. But, I think we need to get back to love. I think the world could use a lot of it. A lot of it. So, yeah. Oh, right next to you, Walter.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I thought it was interesting when you were talking about how Tolkien never looks through the perspective of evil or shows you like the mind of Sauron, and it made me think of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, where he has the letters between the two demons.
Yep.
And so I was just wondering if you think he had any input on like, is it ever helpful to look from the perspective of evil?
Yeah.
And to what extent? And like, kind of a second question, how do we look at evil in the world and like stay up to date on current events while also like filling our imagination and our minds with things that are good?
Those are and what's your name?
Lucy.
What is it?
Lucy.
Good Narnian name. That's a complicated question. It's a very good one. It's a complicated question. So let me put it this way. One of my heroes, a guy named Russell Kirk, and he's been gone. He's a Michiganian. He's been gone since '94. So he's been gone a long time. But one of the things he always said, and when I first heard this, I thought it was trite. I thought it was like a refrigerator magnet or a bumper sticker. He said, you should always just brighten the corner where you find yourself. And I thought, okay, yeah. The older I get, the more brilliant I think that is. It's like, are we going to change anything in Iran? Of course not. Nothing that's going on right now. We're not going to change the bombing. We're not going to change. It's not, no matter what we think about the war, you and I are not going to change Trump's mind on that. We can put political pressure, but we've seen even doesn't really care that much about political pressure. So what are we going to do? But you can treat Walter really well. That counts for a lot. It really counts for a lot. I imagine someone like T.S. Eliot who said, what if you've got an important test the next day, but the person in the dorm room next to you is having a problem? Well, it's probably good to help that person next to you, even though you've got the test the next day. Those are little moments of grace that I think just fill our lives in so many ways. And we have opportunities to do that all the time, to help someone to be good. What is love? Love is the sacrifice of self for another. We always submit to somebody else. It's what manners are. You open a door for someone, you're not being chauvinistic, you're showing their dignity. That's why you open the door for someone, because you're submitting to that person, not showing your superiority, right, at all. So those are the kinds of things, and I long, well, let me tell you guys, I'm sorry, I'm revealing my age here, but I love this story. So when I was a little kid, right, I told you guys I'm 58. When I was a little kid in Kansas, I remember I was at it wasn't Denny's, it was called something else, but basically what a Denny's is now. And a guy started cussing at another table. And that was unacceptable. and 3 other guys at 3 other tables who did not know each other all stood up at the same time. They went over to this guy, and they told him he would stop. That's great. That's what we need in this world, right? We need to be able to do that again. We need manners. We need politeness. We need to treat people with dignity. So those are the kinds of things, and we can do that. Lucy, I mean, we can do it every day, every moment of every day. We can do that. We can choose to make those decisions, to do those right things. So it doesn't have to be saving the world, right? It can be saving Walter. It's okay. That's good, right? And I don't know, he may need it. So, yeah. But anyway, so your other question about evil, again, let me just put it this way. I really do think the genius of Tolkien and Lewis is they made good good, and we don't get bored with it. We keep enjoying it more and more. And almost all modern fiction, we just dwell in decrepitude and sorrow and sin. And it's not necessary, right? We don't want to be Pollyannish, but at the same time, we want creativity and we want beauty. Yeah, good. All right, thank you guys very much. I can see that we're done.